Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the Director of Polling at the Lowy Institute for International Policy, Alex Oliver, former Liberal Party leader and one-time member for Wentworth, John Hewson, now a professor at ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy, war correspondent and filmmaker Michael Weir, who found the dark chamber of his heart in Iraq, Shadow Assistant Minister for Education Amanda Rishworth, and Canadian Christian scholar John Stackhouse. Please welcome our panel. And of course, the current member for Wentworth, Malcolm Turnbull, won't be joining us tonight. There's a lot to talk about. Let's go to our first question. It's from Tom Booth.
The last census, roughly a third of all Australians declared no religion, and this was by far the fastest growing demographic of all Australians. Does the panel think that this demonstrates a lack of spirituality in the Australian community? And do you think this is a positive or a negative, given Australia's status as one of the more peaceful nations on earth?
Michael Weir, let's start with you.
Well, I don't think this is a trend that's limited only to Australia. I think we're finding this in many of the modern liberal democracies. And let's be clear here. Just because an increasing number of people are no longer identifying with organised or institutional religion, that doesn't mean that they're lacking spirituality. And it certainly doesn't mean that they've stopped believing in their religion. But this is something that's going on around the world. I don't know how we can say that it is a good or a bad thing. I mean, are we morally and ethically driven by our churches, our mosques and our synagogues? Not entirely. I think there's a core within us that comes from ourselves where we simply know what is our right and wrong. That I'm not sure just how much it matters that less and less are identifying that way.
Michael, the questioner asked whether having no religion or the people who have no religion might make Australia a more peaceful place. Now, you spent a fair bit of time at the intersection between war and religion. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I'm not sure that we're not a peaceful place as it is. And certainly in the Australian context, I think part of the reason that we've been so fortunate and have been such a peaceful place is what was once the tyranny of distance is also the blessing of distance. It's something that America has experienced where it has two vast oceans on either sides. So it has no immediate threats. We have no land borders that we share with any neighbour, let alone a hostile neighbour. And the other thing that contributes, I think, greatly to the peacefulness that you're talking about is that we live here in a very privileged Western bubble. So I'm not sure how religion plays into the peaceful nature of Australia, either its presence or its lack thereof, because I don't see the elements here to make us otherwise.
John Stackhouse, let me bring you in. I suppose at the heart of that question is whether religion creates conflict rather than peace.
Well, in fact, as Michael says, in a number of countries in the world, including mine, the number of what we call religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, is growing, but the vast majority of those people continue to profess to be spiritual. The number of actual die-hard atheists is actually very few in Australia and in Canada, according to the polls that I've seen. And what's, of course, striking about spirituality is how it fits the temper of the times. Religion is something given to us. Some imam, some rabbi, some priest tells us what to do. There's a historical tradition. You kind of take it or leave it. Whereas with spirituality, I can make it what I like. It can be as powerful as a life-shaping force. It can be a tingle in my toes when I look at the sunset. So it really does suit us in as much as we want it to be suited and part of our lifestyle. So as to whether it in fact encourages violence or peace, of course, it's up to the individual. It's entirely up to you. But because it's that, Tony, it doesn't really have much force to bring us beyond ourselves, to a vision beyond ourselves. There's really not much from the outside feeding it. And so I think we are continuing in the West to live off the Christian ethical deposit of hundreds of years. And in some ways, that's a good thing. And for other people, that wouldn't be such a good thing.
Amanda Richworth, what do you think?
Well, look, I think absolutely we live in a secular nation that is very multicultural and very multi-faith. And I think we've worked really well in Australia to actually build that, accepting of other people's ideas. There's a lot of things that cause conflict. And I think we need to continue to, whether or not the number of people that subscribe to a particular religion is increasing or decreasing, I think a pillar of our democracy has to be that we respect other people's faith, and it's part of what we do as a democracy. In terms of, I think, whether or not people delve into that spirituality, I think those that perhaps don't subscribe to a religion do feel like they're humanists, and they do draw on whatever faith they've been brought up on, do draw on that from time to time, and hopefully it's the good parts of that religion that they do draw on to make our country peaceful.
John Hewson, I'll bring you to the end of that question, which seemed to be suggesting that, or asking the question really, does the fact that so many Australians don't identify as having a religion makes the country more peaceful?
Well, look, I think it's very hard to say. I actually agree with the bulk of what's been said. I just think that the fact that people are not joining churches or active in churches doesn't mean that they've lost their sense of values, their spirituality or whatever. I'd pick up the point that I think in my lifetime, particularly since the post-war, over the post-war period, I mean, when I was a child growing up, you're either Catholic or Protestant, and that was a big issue. And we were told never to marry a Catholic because I was a Baptist and this sort of thing. But the fact that I think our greatest asset today is that we've developed a genuine, tolerant, multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious society that is really understanding of each other's values. And although there have been pressures from time to time, that is the greatest asset we've created since the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, belies the sort of point that you're making.
Alex Oliver.
Tom, I'm one of those 1 in 3. I don't participate in any sort of formal religion. I consider myself to be a peaceful person, not necessarily spiritual. But I think the point about Australia as a multicultural society, and in fact most Western nations now, which are, as you mentioned, Michael, becoming increasingly secular, there's no correlation between, violence or lack of peace and secularity. And Australia is the third most multicultural nation in the OECD, so of all the developed nations. We have an incredibly successful multicultural society, and so this plurality of religion and no religion seems to be creating, actually, conversely, an atmosphere of peace. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, sorry, but when it comes to religion and conflict and this suggestion that, we're more secular, therefore we don't have religion to feed conflict. Often religion can be flame onto a fire, but first there has to be the fire. There have to be the underlying conditions for the conflict in the first place. Sometimes the religion can be something to latch onto. But that's why I say we're so privileged here with our lifestyle. We don't have that sort of friction to begin with, but somewhere certainly in the Middle East where there's widespread poverty, unemployment, lack of education, distinct lack of opportunity. There's no way further to advance your life. It's in a circumstance like that that religion can be a framework to cling to, and that's when it can potentially be a source of conflict.
We've got another question on the topic of religions from Amy Cable.
My question is for John Stackhouse. I'm not a Christian, but I was just wondering how you decide which aspects of the Bible to follow and which to ignore. For example, the Bible encourages slavery in the New Testament, and the Old Testament even goes so far as to name shaving one's head to be sinful. Do you think it's inevitable that Christians will eventually ignore all teachings of the Bible as society's values and attitudes progress?
Yes, I think there is a sense in which folks will say things like, well, parts of the Bible seem absurd to me, so therefore I'll dismiss the Bible. Well, parts of any complex document can seem absurd if you don't know how to interpret it. Parts of the criminal code can seem absurd if you don't understand the context. Parts of any complex legislation can seem absurd, and so people can pick and choose phrases out of their context to make them sound absurd. But the Bible is not a book for kids. The Bible is a grown-up book. It's meant to do grown-up things like form people into whole spiritual human beings and form communities of love across cultural lines over the centuries. So we shouldn't be surprised that one can pick and choose at apparently odd things. That's why people actually go to school to learn how to read the Bible carefully, the way they go to school to read law carefully, or they go to school to read the physical world carefully. So my sense often is a little impatience that folks who would never think that they would contradict an astrophysicist, they never think that they would contradict an airline pilot, feel quite free to say silly things about religion without actually taking the time to study why this book would say what it does. So my sense is you can take or leave the Bible, but please make sure you're taking or leaving a Bible that you've properly studied rather than one you're taking to pieces.
John, this question about whether to take the Bible literally is often raised in connection with same-sex marriage. It's been legal in Canada for a decade now. I guess I'm wondering, have Canadian Christians decided it's not actually sinful after all, or whether they've just decided to ignore some parts of the Bible which would suggest that it is?
Well, I think one of the comments made earlier, I think we might make an important distinction, Tony, between respecting someone's right to hold religious beliefs and respecting the religious beliefs themselves. I don't think religious beliefs are immune to serious scrutiny. In fact, I think that since 9/11, we would say that some religious beliefs deserve condemnation. Some religious beliefs don't make sense. And I think with the questioner's question as well, if parts of the Bible, you've looked at them seriously, don't make sense, then you're entitled to disagree with them and even call them foolish. I think we have to respect every person's right to be a human being and to decide for him or herself about the great questions of the time. But we don't have to actually respect views that we think are foolish. In fact, in an intelligent society, we give and take and we argue about what views should.
I guess my point is, when the law changed, did Christians change their views of these things?
Well, one of the interesting things, Tony, in Canada is that when the law changed almost a decade ago now, we were promised that the views of those who lost the battle would continue to be respected and their freedom to hold those views would continue to be respected. A decade on, that's not turning out to be the case, I'm sorry to say. And what I find is that often now, when I'm engaged in national conversations like this in Canada, I'm not trying to push a particular view for or against same-sex marriage. That ship has sailed, that's the law of the land. I'm actually trying to see if we can avoid the typical revolutionary turn where the people who used to be oppressed now get to turn the screws on the people who used to oppress them. And it seems to me that's disappointing. It's understandable. I mean, if I've been...
But in what sense is that happening?
Well, in the sense that we find that those individuals who try to articulate a view that's not correct are actually shouted down at university campuses, places they should be able to speak up, and institutions that are trying to say we would like to opt out of this consensus are being refused opportunities to participate in Canadian life, including some of our universities.
Amanda Rishworth.
Well, look, I actually think that the conscience vote is a really important part of this debate in the ALP, because I think it does allow people that have strong religious convictions to actually be able to respect them and have their say. At the same time, though, however, what we've seen, I think, in this debate is a lot of excuses made. This will damage our relationship with Asia, it'll lead to polygamy, a range of very odd statements, I think, that don't get back to the crux of the matter, which is, this is my religious belief, I would like to vote a certain way. I respect that, but I don't think we should take the debate down for those that do have that conviction and have that religious belief. We take it down a path that other issues and other excuses are made.
Well, let's just quickly go back to John. 10 years' experience, Christians seeing a rise in polygamy or bestiality?
10 years ago, I went on Canada's national radio program on Sunday morning, which is as popular in Canada as Q&A here is in Australia. And I talked to Michael Enright, and I said in the pre-show briefing, I said, Michael, if this goes through, which of course it did, the next stop will be polygamy. And he said, that's just a ridiculous scare tactic. In the province of British Columbia, 6 years later, a fundamentalist Mormon commune practicing polygamy was charged by the Attorney General of British Columbia after 2 previous Attorneys General had refused to even bring charges because he wasn't sure he could make the charges stick in the new regime. What seemed to be fantastical has actually become the reality in Canada, and the only reason those people were brought up on charges was because they involved underage children, 15-year-old girls. If those girls had been of a majority age, it's not clear in Canada whether polygamy would actually still be illegal.
John Hewson.
Look, I just take John's point to start with about understanding the Bible and understanding the circumstances in which it was written and the points that were being made at that time. I think the difficulty that most people have is to draw lessons from the Bible in today's circumstances, where the world has changed, values have shifted, economic and political circumstances have changed quite dramatically. And there's a danger in that world, I think, where you cherry-pick the bit you like. I find support for what I believe here and I find support for what I'd like to believe over there and ignore the rest. But as far as same-sex marriage goes, I mean, you can interpret the Bible in a particular way and you can say that it's a sin and draw that conclusion. But in today's circumstances, where the world is very different and where values are very different, I think it is a matter of conscience. I'm very strongly of the view it is a matter of conscience. You've got to respect the individual's right to make up their own mind about these issues, and sometimes they make up their own mind for very strange reasons that we can't relate to, but that's their right and we should respect that.
Presumably you'd be extremely disappointed if that weren't the case
yes,
inside the coalition party.
Well, I'm obviously one who believes that we should have a conscience vote and one who believes that we should accept gay marriage as a reality. And it's not going to be easy to bring that about in our political system. I do think that what was said in recent days about a broad-based parliamentary support for a motion is important, but in the end I think it should be a free conscience vote on both sides of politics. One's struggling with the idea of having a conscience vote, the other one's thinking of actually binding people to a particular vote. So we're not making much headway in what is a fairly significant, I think, social issue.
Alex Oliver.
Well, the original question was about the Bible, and you raised the point, John, about, or you made an analogy between the Bible and the criminal code, but of course they're different because the Bible is the Bible and you can't change bits that you don't like. So, and it's a few thousand years old, so it's not adaptable. The criminal code is, so we cast off the bits that are no longer relevant from a couple of thousand years ago and we adapt them to the circumstances of the day. So I guess I find it hard, in a nation and a system where we have a separation of church and state, to be considering laws, including in relation to gay marriage, and basing our decisions on those laws on what the Bible says, given that it is not an organic document and it was not designed for the time that we live in.
Now, the only point I was trying to make, of course, is that the Bible is a complex book and deserves an adult reading. You can take it or leave it as a source of wisdom. We have to be careful, of course. The fact that a text is adaptable or non-adaptable doesn't mean it's irrelevant. I mean, lots of important documents in civilization are done with. We can't adapt the plays of Shakespeare. We can't adapt lots of things that we find to be life-giving. But you do need to at least interpret them with the appropriate skill and discipline. That's all I was arguing
OK, I'm going to move us along because we've got quite a few questions tonight. The next question comes from Akbar Motani.
First, we backed Mujahideens to fight Russians in Afghanistan and destroyed the country apart. Then that created Taliban. We went against Taliban again and ruined the country again. We then went to Iraq and did not find any weapons of mass destruction. We then backed rebels to fight Assad regime that gave birth to ISIS. Have we not helped to create ISIS and these extremists? And are we not fighting the war which was never ours, and bringing this war to our own home soil?
Michael Ware.
Akbar, I'd question a little bit of the potted history there, because to make it very simple, what I would say to you is that the short answer to your question is yes, but it's even more direct than you might think. Inadvertently, mistakenly, unwittingly, we unleashed the Islamic State upon the region and upon ourselves. Now, it became an accident of our own doing. It's a direct result of the invasion of Iraq. And it turns out that the bitter historical irony is that the very thing we say we went there to prevent is the very thing we created. It was Al-Qaeda who attacked the United States 9/11. But by going to Iraq, we provided a platform for a new revolutionary kind of holy war to emerge that's far worse than Al-Qaeda itself. And that's simply because we went in and we removed a regime that wasn't a particularly pleasant regime to begin with. but it was holding certain forces in check. And we removed that and created a vacuum, and one man stepped into that vacuum, a Jordanian militant by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And almost single-handedly, almost from nothing, he created what we now call the Islamic State. It's had various names, but he created it. And I was there in August 2003 in Baghdad, just a few blocks away, when they launched their first ever attack, which was a car bombing on the Jordanian embassy. It was the first car bombing ever in Iraq, and the first of so many that followed.
Now, Michael, anyone who's seen your documentary will know, and those who haven't won't know, how close you came to being murdered, in fact, being beheaded in Baghdad, in the centre of Baghdad, by this forerunner to Islamic State. Can you just outline how that happened, first of all?
Yeah,
because the most remarkable thing is that this happened in central Baghdad, under the noses of the coalition forces.
That's right, and it's always such a pleasure to have to relive this moment on national TV. In a nutshell, in 2004, these guys who went on to become the Islamic State, back then they were called Tawhid wal Jihad, Unity and Holy War, were slowly taking over the entire insurgency. And one of its first signature moments was there in the centre of Sydney, what would essentially be the equivalent, the centre of Baghdad, what would essentially be the centre, the city of Sydney. They took over that neighbourhood. That's a neighbourhood that was within easy mortar range of the US Embassy and the Iraqi Parliament. And it was all under the noses of the American occupation. The American forces were unable to enter that neighbourhood. Now, when they took over that area, the local fighters who they usurped came to me and told me this shocking news. This was a massive development in the war, that the jihadis were now very clearly, palpably taking over. So I was taken in there by some insurgents to confirm this and to convey this to the world, convey this to the US military even. And it was in the process of doing that that I was dragged from my car, hauled behind a building over a period of time, where a hastily slung execution banner was on a wall, and the men were there, the man with the knife, and they were going to film my beheading with my own camera. And it was my insurgent escort who stepped in and saved me and basically threatened these men that, you can kill this man, but he is my guest. And if you dishonour me, we will have a turf war. And reluctantly, they decided that on that moment, on that day, I wasn't worth inflicting a turf war that they'd only just finished winning. And through gritted teeth, they literally shoved me back into the car.
Yeah, I made you tell that story, so
yeah,
people
I
would
really
know
appreciate that.
So people would know just how close you came at the very
it's like
early
sticking your
stages.
thumb into a wound, isn't it, really?
I suppose so. John Hewson, you were listening to the first part of Michael's account and nodding your head about, in a way, the kind of complicity that the Iraq War created.
Look, I have absolutely no doubt that we have ourselves to blame for this. I was one of the sole voices, I guess, at the time of the Iraq War that opposed it openly, when both sides of politics actually were in favour of it. I thought the purpose of the first Gulf War was to eliminate the weapons of mass destruction and to eliminate or reduce their capacity to actually create them. So it didn't seem like a sensible argument. The link between Iraq and al-Qaeda was pretty vague. I mean, al-Qaeda no doubt launched the September 11 attack, but the link to Iraq was very tenuous. I was concerned that by going into Iraq at that stage, in what was in my mind an illegal war, would risk creating civil war in the name of democracy, and pretty much that's where I think we've ended up. And then we left without finishing the job in a military sense. So we've created another layer of complexity. And the justifications for why we were there kept changing at political level. When they found there were no weapons of mass destruction, it was another reason. Had to change, regime change, and then after regime change was pass the power back to the people of Iraq to govern themselves and provide their own security. I think that is a very, very sorry period of our international history, and Australia's role in that, I think, should be an embarrassment to all of us.
Alex Oliver, I'll bring you in, and can I also get you to reflect on recent polling that Lowy has done, which actually reflects widespread Australian support, actually, for the continuation of action in Iraq?
Yes, we've polled for the last more than a decade now, and we know from our historical polling that Australians were not in support, after the fact, were not in support of our military engagement in either Afghanistan or Iraq. So when we asked the questions this year about whether they supported our military action in Iraq now, we were surprised to find that a majority of Australians actually did support it. It was close to 70%. So that was surprising. But what was even more interesting, and this is where I think the argument becomes really sophisticated, is that the majority also said that they thought that this military engagement would increase the risk of terrorism to Australia. And this is something that we know Australians are afraid of. They're more insecure now than they've been at any time in our 11-year polling history. So we know that terrorism is a real fear of Australians. We know that they're concerned that military engagement in Iraq will increase the risk of terrorism to Australia. But there is nonetheless that support. So that support appears to be coming from a sense of moral obligation, that we should be, this is a global problem and Australia should be part of the solution. And perhaps, also feeding into that response is the fact that there are some Australians amongst those foreign fighters and that we have a responsibility there. So they were some really interesting responses on that question.
Amanda Rishworth.
Well, look, obviously I disagree with Dr Hewson and say I don't think the Labor Party was supporting the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the reason we weren't was that it was not an international coalition. It was pretty much a unilateral decision with the US, and one that did not, and the UK, and one that did not seem to have a proper defined mission. Of course, circumstances have changed, and Labor has supported the intervention recently in what the government has decided with 4 major principles, and that is that it continues to be on the invitation of the Iraqi government, a democratically elected government. Even with its flaws, it is a democratically elected government, that we don't actually have direct on-ground combat, and that we do it in an advisory role. And of course, if the forces act in an improper way, that we will withdraw our support, and that it's defined to Iraq. They've been the principles in which Labor has agreed on military action, and we believe the government should give us regular updates on this. But I think in terms of why the Australian people have supported this intervention, I think we saw on our screens what was happening to not only foreign journalists over there, but indeed groups over there, whether it be the Yazidis, the Kurds, the mass atrocities that were actually occurring over there. And I think there was a will to actually participate because it was an international response at the invitation of the government. I think it was quite different to 2003, and something that Labor stood up very strongly and said, we don't see the reason why we're going in there, and whereas I think the times have changed.
Tony, I'd accept the moral argument that we have to do something right now because of the magnitude of the atrocities, the appalling nature of what we see day in, day out on our television screens and read in our newspapers. But you have to ask the question, are we on another slippery slope? I mean, will this ever be solved without troops on the ground, and aren't we implicitly committing ourselves down the road to further escalation of our involvement? And that then go back and do your polling and ask the questions whether people think that's a great idea.
I'll just ask Michael about that because he's been on the ground. Is there a reasonable way of rolling back this threat militarily?
We cannot win this war. Certainly not as it stands now. Certainly not with the tools and partners that are ready, willing and available. And I think there are reasons that we send our troops, but it's certainly not going to be even making the slightest dent in the Islamic State. A few hundred Aussie troops, a few thousand American trainers who aren't even going to combat. What do we think they're going to be able to do when 150,000 troops there for almost 10 years couldn't accomplish? That doesn't mean we don't try. We need to contain the Islamic State and we need to combat them militarily. But the real battlefield where the war with the Islamic State will be won or lost will be the battlefield of ideas. We need to come up with a better alternative as something that provides more opportunity, that has greater appeal than the dark idea of the Islamic State that continues to lure thousands and thousands and thousands of replacement troops. They haven't lost any of their forces because as quick as we can kill them, they're replacing them. And right now, we haven't come up with that alternative. And I think in the wake of 9/11, after the invasion of Afghanistan, there was a moment for this idea to emerge and for us to sell this idea and for the moderate Muslim world to be able to create this idea. But after we invaded Iraq, I think we lost the moral capacity to really have this conversation. And right now we're trapped in that history.
Let me bring in John Stackhouse listening here. You can go right back to the original question, if you like, which is whether or not our actions help create, or coalition's actions, and Canada was part of this, help create ISIS.
Well, this isn't something that I know much about any more than anybody else. It's outside my field of expertise, so I shouldn't comment on that. But if you don't mind, I would echo what Michael's saying, that there is a sense in which, yes, ISIS possibly could be put down by massive force. I mean, one could imagine such a thing, I suppose, in sort of military strategy. And there may be, in fact, a kind of intellectual result of that, because what needs to happen is that this particular form of Islam needs to be delegitimated. It needs to be shown to be not authentic mainstream Islam. It needs to be shown to be the extremist form that it is. And because of the nature of Islamic confidence that when God is on your side, you can't lose. If you do lose, that's a form of delegitimization. And so there's been some strong arguments that we either have to go at them massively so they lose, and that then delegitimizes them, or, as I think Michael said and implies, Muslim theologians and Muslim intellectuals have a lot of work ahead of them to try to delegitimize them in the name of the Quran and the Sharia. And that's the kind of work I'd like to see more of. I'd like to see not just quiet liberals and quiet moderates staying quietly doing their thing, but there needs to be a war of ideas to say that this is not what the Prophet wants, this is not what God wants. And I'm waiting to see that from my Muslim counterparts.
I'm going to shift on to the next question, which is related. It's from Carmina de Campley.
From the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we know that over the next 7 days, an average of 826 Australians will die of cancer, 386 will die of heart attack, 46 of suicide, and 2 of violence in their own home. So how is it that our political leaders can so deeply alarm us, given the total number of people killed in terrorist attacks both here and abroad over the last 37 years, which is when Sydney had its Sydney Hilton bombing, was 113 people?
I'll start with Alex again, because you've obviously done this polling, and I guess the question is really asking why is it that people think the way they do?
Well, importantly, we are a foreign policy institute, so we ask questions on international issues. And the question that you've raised is the balance between international and domestic priorities, and that's not something we ask about. However, when we have occasionally introduced some foreign policy threat and asked Australians for their response to that, and it has had some sort of domestic dimension, like the economy or jobs for Australian workers, we do know what the hierarchy of their priorities are, and interestingly, terrorism continues to reach the top of that list. So what drives that? I guess the images that we see on our televisions, the atrocities that are very available to us visually because of YouTube and social media and all the rest of it. This is very confronting stuff, and I suspect that's why Australians still put this pretty high on their list of priorities.
John Hewson, I'll bring you in because Malcolm Turnbull bought into this in the past week with his quite controversial speech. Essentially, he was saying, one of the things he said, inter alia, tough policies can be popular, they may even be justified at the time they're conceived, but they can still be a mistake. Now, did you take that incidentally, as an open challenge to the way the Prime Minister has been handling these issues?
I don't think he was particularly targeting the Prime Minister. I would say that one of the issues that's behind some of the polling, one of the dimensions that we should focus about, is the extent to which some of these international issues get played out just for domestic significance. And it becomes part of the political point-scoring game rather than a genuine attempt to deal with the magnitude of the issue. So to the extent that politicians run around trying to create fear of terrorists and terrorist attacks, it has a tendency to go too far. I mean, we should be aware, if you like, but not afraid. And part of the domestic political game is to try and get you to be afraid. And I find that once you go that far, it is going too far.
I mean, is your observation that things have gone too far in that direction?
Well, I think in circumstances there are. I mean, they're coming to get us isn't a statement that doesn't ring true to me. You know, it doesn't ring true to me. And I think, to be fair to Malcolm, what he was trying to do is to say, look, this is a significant international issue. But there have been very, very significant international issues that probably dwarf this one in the last 100 or 200 years in international history. And he identified a few of them. That was the context in which I think he was trying to make the point. Keep a sense of perspective on the issue. Be aware of the magnitude of the risk and the nature of the risk, and moderately change your lifestyle, if you like, in response. But don't be afraid, because that is exactly what the terrorists want. They start to win when we get scared and run away.
And when we start to compromise our own values,
that's it.
Our own values, when we start having black sites and reintroducing torture and detention without
to
trial,
their level. Yeah.
Once we start to abandon the values that we hold dear...
When you say we, in this case, you're not specifically referring to Australia, right?
In that regard, in those specifics, no. But here in Australia, if we start surrendering too many of our civil liberties, if we start, taking away judicial overview of some of these detention processes, if we give in to fear and start giving away our democratic values, that's really when the Islamic State's going to be having its victories here in this country.
And I think, too, on this, Tony, I'd like to ask you that part of the problem here is in government. And part of the problem, of course, is that what bleeds leads. And, it's interesting to show a situation of devastation and smoking ruins. But, cancer, car deaths. It's hard to sell that at the news show. How do you feel that news media can do a better job of helping us focus on priorities?
Well, I'll have to change places with you to be on the panel to answer that, but let me ask you, I'll go back to you to ask how has your government responded? Do you find the same thing that's being suggested here, that there's been a kind of overreaction by certain politicians to gain political credibility or political power by using these national security threats?
Well, imagine a group of politicians who might possibly exploit fear in order to gain power. I mean, the mind reels. Of course they do.
Have you seen that in Canada, I guess?
Oh, sure. And we're going through the same nonsense at our airports, this kind of theatre of security where it really doesn't do much except inconvenience us.
But you have had real terrorist attacks. I mean, there was a man who got into your Parliament House armed, killed someone on the outside of the Parliament on his way in.
And I guess I'd say, and as a Canadian, we'd say, so what are we going to do now? Are we going to put giant concrete barriers in front of Parliament? Or are we going to take this as a risk of doing business in an open and free society? I mean, we are willing to do that about cigarettes. We're willing to do it about automobile deaths. We're willing to do it about alcohol. But to then massively overreact in regard to terrorism, it seems to me, as politicians who are basically covering their backside, saying, I don't want to pay the political heat if this happens again. So I'm very happy to fund massive theaters of security at airports. And I say, these aren't terrorists. These are inconveniencists. These are people who are trying to inconvenience us to death. And it's just annoying. We should be, and an economist can back me up, we should be putting our limited resources for the maximum benefit for our society. And it's really infuriating to me that we're spending massive resources with very little to show for it.
Well, let me actually put that to another politician. So Amanda Rishworth, can I put it this way? Is it fair to say that Mr Turnbull's speech was a more searching critique of the government's anti-terror policies and national security policies than anyone in Labor has come up with?
Well, look, it's hard to know because Malcolm's not here to answer your questions tonight, but I have seen his speech. And look, going back to the question, I would say that it's making the assumption that we can't deal with a number of important issues in front of us. Yes, there is a real threat. Yes, cancer is incredibly important. Yes, domestic violence is incredibly important. And indeed, it's a lot of other things. But I would have to say that I would reject the assumption that Labor hasn't been actually critiquing the legislation that has come before the Parliament, because there has been legislation come before the Parliament in which has been critiqued quite thoroughly by Labor and indeed made significant recommendations and amendments in terms of oversight to the Foreign Fighters Act, for example, in which we've improved the independent oversight of that, improved definitions and made sure it's targeted. So I don't think we can only deal with one issue at once. National security is an important issue, but so are all the other issues. And if politicians can't deal with more than one thing at once, then I think we've got questions to answer.
OK, we can deal with more than one thing at once in this program, and we're going to. You're watching Q&A, it's live, it's unpredictable. The next question is a video. It's from Ashton Platt in Highbury, South Australia.
Hello, this is a question for the panel. Recently in the school holidays, I've been watching World War II films such as The Book Thief and Woman in Gold. History interests me because we can learn so much from the past to do better in the future. What I've learnt from these films is that attacking freedom of speech becomes one way in which dictators try to control public debate and thoughts. I know I'm only 10, but what Tony Abbott scares me when he attacks the ABC and tries to control what we see on it. Should we all be afraid of his attacks on Q&A and ABC, both things I love?
I didn't hear the last one. John Hewson, we'll start with you. Just didn't hear the last thing he said.
Yes, so the last thing he said, because people were clapping, should we be afraid of his attacks, Tony Abbott's? He was suggesting on Q&A and the ABC, both things I love.
Look, there's fault on both sides in this skirmish, which I'm staggered has lasted as long as it has. Quite frankly, look, you guys made some mistakes. You put him on, you let him talk rather than cutting him off, then you repeated the program, then you tried to justify it as an attack on a defence of free speech. On the other side, you know, Abbott obviously went over the top and said, that heads have to roll and a whole host of other things. I mean, in the first law of digging holes was when you get to the bottom, you stop digging. And you guys kept digging on both sides and you're still digging. I think we should draw a line in the sand and say, OK, we've both learned something from this. I think it's wrong for the government to try and demand a particular change in policy on the part of the ABC. Equally, I think the board of the ABC, and there's some here, have a responsibility to address the issue from their own point of view. Now, I'm not sure, I gather the outcome is that you're going to be moved from entertainment in the ABC to news. Are we entertainment tonight or are we news?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, but I hasten to add the television division, which is what we're talking about, also does documentaries, so it isn't entirely entertainment. But it's a fair point you make, and we'll see where we end up. But let me go to Michael Ware.
Well, I would agree. There's been hyperbole and ridiculous extremism on both sides of this, but for me, I've been a bit of a, free speech warrior all those years that I was in Iraq. I was going out to find the other side, to hear their point of view, to understand their point of view, particularly at times in the early part of the war where the American war machine had no idea who it was fighting and it didn't understand why these men would be shooting at them. So, I took it upon myself to go and ask them. Right? But that ultimately led to an understanding. Not single-handedly, but 4 or 5 years later, 107,000 Iraqi insurgents go onto the US government payroll and the insurgency stopped virtually overnight. My question is, if we don't have people like Zaki Mallah on a show like this, that's quite responsibly run, and is quite a sophisticated forum, then when are we going to hear their voices? I mean, if you want to put it, in a purely self-interested term, know thy enemy. Well, I don't want to frame it like that. But we need to understand these people. And look, let's face it, Zaki Mallah, give that man enough rope and he'll verbally hang himself. And I think he did that. So if you want the Australian people to support what you're trying to do with combating these threats, then let's hear from some of these voices in some of these forums, and they'll do all the work you need them to do to get the Australian people to understand why we have to do this.
Alex, go ahead.
Well, what annoyed me this week, and quite a lot of things annoying me as I become a grumpy old woman, was that, this prevention of ministers from coming on the program. I mean, surely if the government is convinced of the rightness of its policies and its positions, then it should be prepared to allow debate on them. And this is one of the forum for debate. So that annoys me. The other thing that annoys me is that, we've got serious issues to address as a nation. We've talked about some of them tonight, but we've also got, a Chinese economy in chaos, and we've got the prospect of Brexit, although that seems to have been averted suddenly this evening. We've got, terrorism and military action in the Middle East, and yet our Prime Minister seems to be spending an inordinate amount of time micromanaging the appearances of his ministers. So that's just annoying, and I think silly, and a bit of an own goal from this government, and it's protracting the debate. As we've been doing this for weeks now.
Yes, happy to move on.
For much longer than it needed to be.
Yes, go on.
I just going to add one point. I mean, in my experience in politics, you're desperate to get coverage at all, particularly the sort of coverage you want. And if you get a show that's going to run for an hour or so and give you a decent platform to look at issues in some detail, you should grab it with both hands and not let those opportunities go.
I'm just going to bring John Stackhouse in here, looking at it as an outsider. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree. And not having a program like this in Canada, and I can't think of one in the United States that's not in the Sunday morning news ghetto. It's quite extraordinary for me to come to Australia and have a primetime program that's set up like this. There are so few opportunities in a modern democracy to be able to address power and to be able to say things they don't want to hear. I mean, I'm not surprised Tony Abbott's done what he's done. I'm annoyed too, but I'm not surprised because he'd much rather us talk about these things. Now, for your part, Tony, I think that you'd be delighted with a Prime Minister who's adopted a zero-tolerance policy for serious mistakes, and I'm sure you'll look forward to him applying it to himself and his cabinet.
OK, we're going to move on. The next question is a Facebook question from Lacey Sims. And I'll read it out. Shorten is in a bad position. If I'm Tony Abbott and co, then I'd call a snap election right now. Is the best thing for Labor to dump him, that is Shorten, and appoint someone else? And we'll go straight to Amanda Rishworth.
Thought you might. Look, I think we need to look at why this Royal Commission was set up. It will be no surprise to you in the audience that Labor believes that this was absolutely designed for political means for Tony Abbott to smear his opponents. Indeed, the two Royal Commissions that were set up have had each of Tony Abbott's opponents, the two Prime Ministers, Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, and now the opposition leader, Bill Shorten. John Howard also made some comments saying that at the beginning of these Royal Commissions, these were very targeted political attacks. And I think if John Howard's saying that, I don't usually agree with John Howard on a lot of things, but I certainly agree there.
Well, now that you've made a targeted political attack on the Royal Commission, let me ask you a really fundamental question. Is it in any way a conflict of interest for a union leader conducting secret talks with his employers, with the employers that he's trying to create a workplace agreement with, secret talks to try and get money for the union while simultaneously doing a workplace agreement on behalf of the workers?
Well, the first point I'd made is that payments to the union were absolutely answered by Bill Shorten.
Is it a conflict of interest, really? It's a sort of question of principle I'm asking.
Well,
you.
if we look at the principle of what the underlying assumption of that principle is that unions and employers can't work together to actually do what's in the best interest for employees and employers. It's suggesting that unions will always be at conflict with employers, and it suggests that you can't come to an agreement.
But is it not a conflict of interest to simultaneously conduct an open workplace agreement negotiation while having a secret negotiation with the employer about getting money for the union?
Well, once again, it's the principle of whether or not employers can work with employees, whether employers can work with unions.
Why do it secretly?
Oh, well,
I mean, if it's all above board, why not just make it part of the open agreement?
Bill Shorten answered 900 questions at the Royal Commission. He was on the stand. He was willing to cooperate. But I think, I think a lot of people have been surprised that first the Abbott government complains unions are too militant and they're always on strike and they're hurting our economy. And then on the other side, you now have got the criticism that you've got a moderate union leader wanting to work in the best interest of employees and employers and getting productive workplaces.
Would you agree that all that would have been fine if it weren't for the secret deal?
Well, there's no evidence to suggest that Bill Shorten's dealings with employers actually affected these workplace agreements. There were good outcomes for workers and good outcomes for the organisations.
All right, let's hear from John Hewson on this.
Look, I think I'd probably make 2 points. I mean, one, when you go into public life, you've got to be prepared to accept the fact that you're going to be scrutinised. There isn't much about your life, past, present or future, that isn't going to be dug up and dug into and exposed and that you're going to need to defend or explain. And I think that's the background of public life. It's a bit worse than it was in my day. It's become far more